Hey there, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that hopefully will apply to you this winter, and that is winter composting. Before we get started, I want to share with you a story from this past weekend. As I'm recording this, I went to a women's event at our church, and a local chef that I adore, she goes to church with us. She did a cooking demonstration right in front of us. She made this amazing chicken and wild rice soup, and many of you guys know I love to garden, but I'm not a great cook, so I'm always all ears at how I can cook better, especially when I'm using my own garden's harvest. As she started peeling the onion and working on the celery and the carrots and all of that, she had a trash bowl, which I was excited about because I was thinking, okay, a trash bowl, that's normal, that's what I do too. But then I cringed when I saw that she put the cartons of chicken broth, after she had put the chicken broth into the soup, she put the cartons in the trash bowl. And that's when I realized that her trash bowl and my trash bowl are completely different. Her trash bowl actually had trash that was going into the trash can, whereas my trash bowl that I use has things that I compost, and it goes directly in the compost pile. I actually had the fleeting thought of, I want to take that and I want to take the cartons of chicken broth out of there, and I want to take this home so that I can put it in my compost, just because that's become such a thing for me over the years, is using all of the kitchen waste that I can to be able to make compost. In fact, it's kind of a funny thing with my kids because they're 18 and 14 and they're at the age where they can roll their eyes at their mom at the crazy stuff that mom does. But they have almost found it to be a joke where if I'm in the room and they have eaten a banana or they have an apple core, they will just look at me and almost try to throw it in the trash can, which is right below where my compost bucket is, to see if they can get away with it. And they never do. At least if I see it, I'm always on top of them, and I actually make them fish that out of the trash if they dropped it and put it into the compost bowl. I'm so particular about that. It's funny how we can get like that with certain things, but I am like that with my kitchen scraps and my compost. It's something that I've just started to do when I first started gardening, and it's something that I don't stop doing in the winter, even when it's hard to walk outside in the cold and put my kitchen scraps in my compost pile. It's something that I want to do year round. And I'm able to use that compost in my garden as a source of nutrition for my soil. So the question you may have is it possible to compost in the winter? Because winter composting is different than composting during the growing season. And what we're going to talk about today is how to make it work for you and what you can expect when you start composting, especially those kitchen scraps that you have over the winter. This episode is brought to you by the Homestead movie coming to theaters on December 20th. This movie is a fictional account of an ex-Green Beret and his family who escaped to an eccentric prepper's fortress after a nuclear bomb is detonated in Los Angeles. It shows how families survive by living off the land amidst chaos around them. My family got to pre-screen this movie, and I especially appreciated and enjoyed its emphasis on living on the land and building community. When you pre-order your tickets using the link in the show notes, you could win your own homestead worth $300,000, including a tiny home, a greenhouse, and a 6-month emergency supply of food storage, among countless other items in the giveaway. To watch the movie's trailer and pre-order the tickets and enter the giveaway, just head to the link in the show notes. Before we start talking about winter composting, you may be new to composting altogether, and you may wonder, what is it that causes organic materials like our kitchen scraps, plant debris, paper, and more like shredded leaves and all sorts of organic matter? What makes it turn into nutritious compost for our gardens? It's almost like magic. You put it all into a pile, and whether you have a hot compost pile or a cold one, we're going to talk about both of those, eventually it all breaks down and it turns into what we know as compost. But what is it that makes that magic? In a compost pile, it's bacterial colonies and their activity that breaks down the ingredients that you put in your compost pile. This bacteria is aided by other fungi and other microbes and even decomposers like pill bugs and earthworms. All of it works together to decompose what you put in your compost pile to make it into compost. But as I said, the most important thing is the bacterial colonies that are actively breaking down what we put into our compost. And those bacterial colonies are dependent on temperature. There are actually different types of bacterial colonies that thrive depending on the temperature of the compost pile. And this definitely makes a difference as we're talking about winter composting. I'm going to get there, but hang in there with me because I think you might find this interesting. If not, just hang in there. I'll get to the good stuff in just a minute. But with those bacterial colonies, they come in three distinct categories. You have thermophilic organisms, and they thrive in heat. You're going to see those most active if you have a hot compost pile. And then you have mesophilic organisms, and those are the most common types that you have in your compost that you're probably have working for you in your compost pile during the growing season. And those are found most in ambient compost piles. And then we have psychrophilic, I hope I said that right, organisms, and they are active in the cold. So even in the winter, this type of bacterial colony is what is active in the winter. They work really hard, but they are slower than the others. So the thing that you need to know about winter composting is that this will happen slower. The only time that decomposition stops in a compost pile is when materials are completely frozen. And most of the time, our compost piles are not going to be completely frozen for most of us. Now, some of you who live in really frigid, cold winter areas, this may be an exception for you. But for many of us, even when freezing temperatures are common, it's not likely that the compost pile is going to all out freeze, which means decomposition is still happening in the winter. Let's talk about hot composting and cold composting, and let's talk about the difference between the two. When you think of composting and when you see YouTube tutorials, for example, you're probably seeing an example of hot composting. This is where the temperature of the compost pile gets really hot and those thermophilic bacteria dominate and they break down the compost pile really quickly in the matter of weeks or just a couple of months. But to get a hot compost pile, you have to be active in it. You have to manage it well. You have to focus on the ratio of brown ingredients and green ingredients and turn it and make sure the moisture is perfect. And I have to be honest, with everything that I do in my garden, I do not have time to babysit a compost pile. If you don't have a huge garden, this may be something that you want to go all in with, and I find it really fascinating. But you may wonder, if you are one of those that you want to go all in on hot composting, is it even possible to happen during the winter? Well, it may be possible in the winter, but insulation may be necessary. For a hot compost pile, you're, number one, going to need more space. You're going to need to have at least a 3x3x3 compost pile to have enough organic matter to be able to have those reactions go on in the center of the pile that allows it to be heated. If in the winter you're still wanting a hot compost pile, you may need to cover the pile with straw, leaves, or even a tarp to keep it warmer and to retain moisture. Because again, having a hot compost pile depends on moisture just as well as it does greens and browns and the other microbial life that is already in most of your organic matter. Most of us are not going to be hot composting in the wintertime. If you are hot composting in the winter, then I'm sure there's way better resources than my podcast for that because it gets pretty scientific and in-depth. Most of us are going to be cold composting, and I cold compost all year round because that's just the easiest way for me. I call it lazy composting because it's just a matter of piling all the organic matter in, waiting for it to break down. This is the most common type of home composting for home gardeners, especially if you don't plan to actively manage it. And many of us in the winter are not going to be actively managing our compost pile, especially if we don't like the cold. Raising my hand here. We just want to get out there to add this stuff and then get back inside to the warmth as quickly as possible. But what you need to know about cold composting is that it takes longer, because you don't have the rapid activity of that thermophilic bacteria. But hey, you have all winter. So even if it's going to take many months, even if it's going to be slower to happen, you've got all winter to make it happen. Either way though, let's talk about whether you're doing hot composting or cold composting. Either way, There are some best practices that are going to help you be more successful in composting over the winter. Number one, even if you're not doing hot composting, heat is your friend. The warmer that compost pile can be, the more active the bacteria in the compost are going to be, especially in the winter. So how can you keep your compost pile as warm as possible? I would recommend to consider insulating it. Now, this may depend on how cold you get in the wintertime, but you can surround your compost pile with bags of leaves or straw bales, or even sawdust or wood chips, but anything you can do to insulate the outside of the compost pile, that can help. Basically, anything you can do to trap as much heat as possible will help that decomposition happen quicker. The second thing that you can do over the winter is layer your greens and your browns. Just like summer, this is always the best method. To have a good compost pile, you need to have greens and browns. I have more information on what that actually means in another podcast episode. I'll get to that in just a minute. But what you need to know is that your kitchen scraps are greens. And the temptation over the winter is just to throw out all of our kitchen scraps and just put it all in a pile. And if we do that, in the absence of any browns, this, especially in the wintertime, can cause a wet, stinky mess. To counteract that, because think about it, if you just fill your compost bucket up with kitchen scraps, it's going to start smelling. And that's because there is an imbalance there and it's not what we want. The same thing can happen in our compost pile as well. But to counteract that, we want to add browns. One thing that you can do is you can keep a pile of shredded leaves or even straw right next to your compost bin and periodically add a layer of that on top of whatever you put in your compost. Some people do it every time. If they take out their compost bucket and they put it in their compost pile, they'll just grab a handful of leaves and put on top of it. I think that's a good idea. I don't always do that every time, but I think that's good to be able to continue layering those greens and browns, which is going to help with that decomposition. And it also will prevent it from becoming stinky and wet and allow that compost pile to do what it was supposed to do. The next thing you can do is reduce the size of your inputs. The smaller the size of your ingredients in your compost pile, the quicker they're going to break down. They have more surface area. The microbes, the decomposers, they're going to have less to have to break down if they are in smaller pieces. So shred your paper instead of just throwing the paper all together. Chop your onion peels a little bit finer. The finer you can get the ingredients, the better. Crush your eggshells. Those are just examples of getting them in smaller pieces. And then another recommendation is don't turn your compost pile during the winter or turn it less frequently, because even though turning is recommended in the warmer months, in the winter months, when you turn, this will release the heat. And remember, we want the heat to be retained as much as possible. So when we release that heat, it could slow down the decomposition. Instead, wait until the weather starts to warm up to start turning your compost pile. This episode is brought to you in part by Organic Rev. I use Organic Rev in my garden throughout the season, but I find myself turning to it more and more, especially over the fall and winter. Organic Rev helps plants to be able to withstand stress and to be able to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. In my climate, in the fall and winter, we can go to spring-like 70-degree weather to freezing and below within 24 hours, and that can be hard on plants. But when I add Organic Rev to my plants, it helps them to be able to withstand these drastic changes. It also helps the soil to hang on to that moisture, which is important to be able to protect those roots from freezing temperatures. I add a dilution of Organic Rev, about an ounce to a gallon, not only to prepare my crops for rapid changes, but also to help them remediate after they have gone through a freeze. I did that all last year when I grew my winter greens throughout the year, especially when we got down to 0 degrees and some of my plants were really damaged. Organic Rev helped them perk right back up. While you may think of Organic Rev as perfect for seed starting and transplanting and growing during the growing season, it's actually a great companion if you're growing anything in the fall and winter, and you can also use it for your indoor houseplants. To get 10% off of your order of Organic Rev, go to organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10. Get your bottle now, use it for what you have growing, and have it ready to go for when next season begins. Again, organicrev.com. compost.com and use my promo code JILL10. One other question you might think about when it comes to your compost pile in the winter is whether to add wood ashes to your compost pile. Many of us are burning our wood for our fireplaces, and we have all this extra ash laying around, and we want to know, can we use it? It's organic matter. Well, a little won't hurt, but a lot can be a problem for your compost pile. The reason is this. Wood ash has a very high alkaline pH level, and this will quickly raise the pH of a compost pile. Not only will it raise the pH of the compost pile itself, but a high pH actually decreases microbial activity. Most beneficial organisms do best when the pH is neutral to slightly acidic. So you don't want to add a whole lot of ashes to your compost pile because you don't want to risk raising that pH. Now, if you're like me and your soil is naturally acidic, you can add those wood ashes directly to the soil. If your garden is like mine and you know that it's naturally acidic, then you can consider adding those wood ashes directly to the soil. Now, I have to tell you, it's probably best to make sure you do a soil test, and you could even look up some application rates for wood ash. I'll tell you, I've never done that. I just know that my soil is acidic, and so I just sprinkle my wood ash on my garden, and it's not ever been a problem. It's actually been good for it. So potassium is actually a macronutrient that sometimes our soils can be deficient in. So I still think we need to use the wood ashes that we might have, but it's not best to put them in a compost pile. The next question you may wonder about is snowfall. This is one I don't have a lot of experience with because we don't get a lot of snow here in Arkansas, and when we do, it's like a national holiday because it's a big deal. But many of you get snowfall pretty regularly, and you may wonder how that compares or how that affects your winter compost pile. Well, as you may know, snowfall is a natural insulator. So somewhat, it can be a good thing because we do want heat in our compost pile. But it can also restrict airflow, and the airflow is needed in our compost pile for decomposition. So if you have consistent snowfall on your compost pile for a long period of time, you might want to clear away some of the snow occasionally, or what you could do is before the snow even falls, you can put a tarp on your compost pile to act as an insulator, and then when you have the snow that's on top of that, then it'll continue to act as an insulator, but you also have the airflow kind of from the sides of that compost pile. So that is an idea if you get snowfall continually. The thing that you want to keep in mind with a compost pile, and this is whether you're doing it in the wintertime or in the summer, is that moisture level is important. It should stay moist, but not soggy. This is a challenge in my garden because we get a lot of rain over the winter, and so a lot of times my compost pile tends to be on the more soggy side. You need to consider your own climate, though. Consider covering if you live in a dry area to try to trap some of that moisture, but maybe take the cover off when you know it's going to rain so that it can get moisture back in it. But if you live in a wet climate like I do, you might want to consider covering it to keep it from getting too soggy. Again, this is one of those things I've really never done, and it still always worked out okay, but I'm just trying to tell you the best practices with all of this to get the best results. Hey, just jumping right in here, if you are brand new and composting is new to you, I have some resources for you. I have a few podcast episodes and a YouTube video for you. We're going to have all these links in the show notes. You may be most interested in episode number 162, which is called Simplifying Compost. Episode 137, Compost Piles versus Tumblers. You may not even have a compost pile and you may be trying to decide what you want to use. I'll tell you, even after I recorded that, I use my pile more than my tumbler, so keep that in mind. But it does give you a breakdown of comparing both of them. And then we have episode number 7, Composting Basics for Beginners. This is one that obviously was one of my first podcast episodes, so I can't promise what the quality is, and I don't even want to listen to it just in case, but I feel like it's going to have the basics that you need to know. Just be gentle as you're listening. And finally, I have a YouTube video called Lazy Composting. This video shows you how I actually do composting and how I have been for many years. And it might be encouraging for you because it's not super scientific, but it works. It may take longer, but it works and it's easy for me. So check out all of those links in the show notes after you're done listening to this episode. As we finish up here, just a few more things you might find helpful. Number 1, What if your compost pile starts to steam in the wintertime? Steam is actually a good sign. It shows activity and it shows that it's working. It's probably not going to happen for most home gardeners. The only time I have seen a compost pile steam is when I order bulk compost from my local landscaping company and it's still kind of in the process, and then you could see the steam. But I've honestly never found that in my personal compost pile, so it's okay if it doesn't happen. Just know that if you're not seeing it much, it's probably a cold compost pile. I mentioned earlier that decomposition activity stops when your compost pile freezes. So you may be wondering, is that a terrible thing? If your compost pile freezes, that is okay, because when the weather warms up, the activity will begin again. I actually had someone several years ago, and I think he lives in Canada or somewhere way north of me. And he talked about how his compost pile will sometimes freeze. But what that means is he's noticed when it starts to thaw, then a lot of those cell walls of the ingredients have broken down with the freezing, and they actually start to decompose quicker than if maybe he had put them in the same compost pile in the summer. So I'm not saying the whole process would have been quicker, but the freezing weather helped to break that material down. So when the warm weather arrived, it started breaking down quickly. The key that I want to leave you with today is to compost one way or the other. Don't get caught up with having to do it all perfectly and have a hot compost pile. The more that you can add your organic matter, the more that you're going to have a nutritious amendment for your soil, and the more you're going to save that material from the landfill, which is a huge deal when it comes to our climate and emissions. The more you can do this, the better. And as we finish up, let me share with you what you might be able to expect. The final compost that you have after composting all winter will be dependent on the speed of decomposition. It also will be dependent on how serious you are about managing it. If you just let it go, it's probably not going to be ready to use in your spring garden, but that's okay. Even if you don't have a final product of compost at the end of the winter, you likely will have it by the middle of the spring, the summer, and for sure by the time your fall garden arrives. Regardless, as I mentioned before, you're saving your kitchen scraps, you're saving other organic material from the landfill, and you're creating a rich organic amendment that will nurture your garden. So if you don't have a compost pile yet, this is a great time to get started and start getting in the rhythm of being able to use these organic materials that you already have on hand to compost into something you can use in your garden. And then when spring comes, you've already got a process and it's ready to go. Don't forget to check out the links in the show notes for more information on composting if you're new. And I would love to hear your thoughts. If you have composted in the winter, please let me know. You can reach me at The Beginner's Garden on Instagram, or you can comment on YouTube or Spotify. And I would love to hear your thoughts. As I said, the key is to compost, and I hope that you do it. I hope you love it, and I hope it will become a part of your garden lifestyle like it has been mine. I'll chat with you again in next week's episode. I hope you have a fabulous day. This episode was brought to you by the movie Homestead. Watch how a prepper's family wrestles with real challenges around food security, safety, and community when life as they know it changes in an instant. It's an adventure film that's both captivating and challenging. Check out the trailer for yourself, and when you pre-order tickets at the link in the description, you could win your own equipped homestead worth $300,000. And the earlier you pre-order tickets, the more entries you get. The movie hits theaters on December 20th, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.